Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We continue on now with verse 47 of Baqarah and onward. Um, so, Ya Bani Israel, izkaru nimatiya alladhi an'amtu alaykum wa anni fadwaltukum ala al-alamin. O children of Israel, remember my blessing, which I blessed you with, and that I favored you or preferred you over the worlds. Wataku yawma la tajzi nafsun an nafsin shay'a wa la yuqbalu minha shafa'atu wa la yukhadhu minha adlun wa la hum yunsar. Wa'idh, sorry, I should translate that. And defend yourself or protect yourself from a day not avails a soul, another soul. So no soul avails another soul, anything. And not is accepted from it intercession. And not is taken from it a ransom. And not they are helped. Wa'idh najainakum min ali fir'aun yasumunakum suwa al-adhab yudhabihun abna'akum wa yastayun nisa'akum wa fi dhalikum bala'un min rabbikum azim. And when we saved you from the people of Pharaoh, or the people of Pharaoh, who were afflicting you with evil punishment or horrible punishment, slaughtering your sons and letting live your women. And in that was a trial from your Lord, great. وَإِذْ فَرَقْنَا بِكُمْ الْبَحْرَ فَأَنْجَيْنَكُمْ وَأَغْرَقْنَا آلَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَأَنْتُمْ تَنْظُرُونَ. And when we parted for you the sea, so we saved you, and we drowned the people of Pharaoh while you were looking. Okay, so that's verses 47 through 50 of Baqarah. So obviously this passage is directly addressed to Bani Israel, or the children of Israel, the Jewish people. And we've heard that direct address already in verse 40, Ya Bani Israel. So this whole passage is kind of especially applicable to the Jewish people, especially, I guess, in the time of Muhammad, but nevertheless applies to all humans and people of any time period, Muhammad's time or ours. So we have to think about sort of how it applies to both audiences. So first of all, in verse 47, God is specifically calling upon the audience or audiences to remember a blessing, right? So this is one of the main points of the Quran, and it's something we've already seen earlier in Baqarah, which is you have to stop and consider how much you've received from God. And of course, this applies to any human being whatsoever, right? If you exist, if you have life, if you have the means of sustaining life, you have already a sort of immeasurable debt to God. And we've talked about this already, and that's kind of the point of God's saying, in Fatiha that he is Maliki Yom al-Din, master of the day of the debt. It's usually translated the day of judgment, but God is calling the day of judgment the day of debt, presumably because it is precisely our debt to God in that we've received everything from him that we are held accountable for when this life ends and we go back to him, right? The question is, have we acknowledged that debt and have we tried to pay that debt by serving him and by giving thanks to him? So this is of a piece, this command to Bani Israel to remember what God has given them is of a piece with his commands to all of humanity earlier in Baqarah to remember what he has given us, and basically to pay that debt. So it says that God has favored the Jewish people over all the worlds. Even there, that can apply to all humans, right? Because what did we learn just a little while ago in Baqarah? That over all other creatures, human beings were given this special privilege and responsibility of being God's Khalifatan in the earth, his representatives or substitutes. And that was such an astounding decision that even the angels, who are not at all, of course, prone to questioning God, question God, however gently, and say, why would you give them this great responsibility? They're going to spread corruption, they're going to shed blood, etc. And that's what causes the rift between Iblis and God. Iblis refuses to honor human beings as the angels are commanded to do. So it's that special privilege given to humans is kind of echoed in the special blessings given to Bani Israel. What was that special blessing? It's very similar to what we receive in the Quran. They get a book from God, these tablets that are given to Musa, which are often kind of identified with the Ten Commandments of the Bible, but we can infer that they were more extensive than that because it says everything was explained in these tablets given to Moses. We'll read about that later. But for now, it's sufficient to know the Jewish people were given the book, right, the Torah. And that alone is this great blessing. But what we've learned already in Baqarah is that all people were given the book, right? Starting with Adam. First, Adam has, through some means, communication from God, where God is telling him, this is this garden is yours to eat from freely, just don't eat from this tree. And then when Adam and Eve disobey that command, God still communicates with them, turns to them because they've turned to him, and speaks to them yet again in some way, and then promises to send further words, which will be guidance to Adam and all of Adam's people, all of humanity, if they will follow those words, that guidance, and will save them from whatever problems have accrued to the human race through their disobedience. So, starting with Adam, human beings have been blessed not only as being God's representative, but also as being recipients of God's book, right? And so then the Jews, when they receive God's book, it's really just a further reiteration of that blessing. And if the Jewish people are special, it's partly because starting with Jacob, I mean, Jacob is the first, in a sense, the first Jewish person because he is known as also as Israel, right? So Jacob is Israel. Jacob's father was Isaac, and Isaac's father was Abraham. But that whole line, starting with Abraham and then Abraham's grandson being Jacob or Israel, are people that have received guidance from God. And there's this line of prophets. I mean, that's the special blessing to the Jews, is that they were given this line of prophecy that extends all the way up to Muhammad's time. And that's partly, in large part, the rift with um, Muhammad is that, well, he's not a Jewish prophet. God sends a prophet who's not a Jew, and that's very rare for that time period. Um, but in any case, really, though, the blessing, like I'm saying, is just echoing the blessing that was given to humans generally, which is that they receive prophecy, they receive communication from God. And the Jews, despite whatever rifts within their community where people would not follow the prophet, they preserved some tradition of actually following the guidance from God. And so that was their special blessing. Um, okay, so remember that I blessed you over all the worlds, um, and protect yourself from a day when nobody will be able to help anybody else, and also won't even be able to help him or herself. Because when it says no ransom will be accepted, meaning you can't do anything to save yourself on that day. The only saving that can happen has to happen before that day occurs. So that's why it's so crucial to remember and defend against that day, because it will be too late if it comes before you've defended against that day, right? Um, so we have here verses 47, 48, two seemingly disparate statements, right? The first is saying, remember that I've specially blessed you. And then the next one is saying, I be warned and defend yourself from a day when you are going to be all alone, right? So what's the connection? Well, the obvious implicit connection is if you fail to remember my favor, my special blessing upon you, then that day when no soul will help another will be a very, very grievous day for you, right? It'll be a day of punishment. Um, so the stakes of remembering here and of being grateful are very, very high. We don't usually think that the most important thing we can do is remember, or even that the most important thing we can do is be grateful. But what the Quran is telling us, and it already kind of has told us this in earlier verses of baqarah, is that this is the most crucial thing, is are you remembering what God has given you, or are you forgetting it? Are you being grateful for what God has given you, or are you being ungrateful for it? This is the sort of litmus test. This is what will determine whether you go to heaven or go to hell. And that's and on the one hand, that seems like a familiar idea. I mean, how often do we hear about the importance of being grateful? We even have in the West, we have, or at least in America, we have a whole holiday devoted to it. It's called Thanksgiving, right? And it's traditional, not in my family, but in a lot of families, for everyone at the Thanksgiving table to go around and say what they're grateful for. And beyond that one day, of course, there's also plenty of practices. It's often called mindfulness, where people try to consider all the things they're grateful for. It's called counting your blessings. So it's well established in the West and elsewhere that gratitude is very important and that it's very good for your mental health, and that forgetting all that you have to be grateful for is bad for your mental health. But nevertheless, the idea, especially within religious circles, the idea that the most important thing for you to do is to be grateful and to remember what you have received from God, and that if you fail to do those things, you stand a very good chance of going to hell. That idea, I think, will still seem strange and perhaps even offensive to a lot of readers. But I find it hard not to draw that conclusion from what I'm reading here, as well as throughout the Quran, that this is really the key thing. Not whether you, and not to disparage or um, make light of what I'm about, the other things I'm going to list here, but I'm just saying it's not, none of the things I'm about to list seem to be put in the same position of importance as remembering and being grateful for what God has given you. So, for instance, giving charity, going to masjid, bowing down to God 5 times a day, um, doing Hajj, the clothes that you wear, the food that you eat, um, whatever you can think of that's a physical, that has a physical dimension to it. None of those things is given the kind of importance in the Quran um, that remembering God and remembering specifically God's blessings is given, right? Um, and so that's why I'm explaining the sequence here between, or the connection between verse 47 and 48. Remember my favor, my blessing, which I blessed you with. And then I favored you over all the worlds, which, as I said, yes, that can be applied specifically to the Jewish people. It does say Yabani Israel, but it obviously applies to all humans because the worlds, and that's plural, alamin, implies beyond our ken, beyond our knowledge. So human beings have been blessed beyond all other creatures. Um, so it applies to everyone. So that's 47, and then 48, and protect yourself. Basically, protect yourself from hell. Protect yourself from the day on which some people will be sent to heaven and others sent to hell. And there's nothing they can do to change the judgment at that point. So, what's the connection? That whether or not you remember that God has blessed you over all other beings will determine whether you go to hell or not. So, again, it's pretty explicit. It's just easy to pass over, I think, because when we read the Quran or any other religious text, I think we tend to kind of have a little bit of tunnel vision, and we're looking for the things we already recognize. So we're going to hone in on the things that confirm what we already think is the message of the Quran, or what we would call Islam, which is an already, almost 1,500 years old tradition that's called Islam, and it's accrued any number of practices and beliefs. And some of them are confirmed by the Quran, and some of them are not. But when we read the Quran, it's tempting to, whether or not we are really attached to those Islamic traditions, it's tempting to look for things that match with them, right? We look for things that make sense and that are familiar. So we might quickly pass over this because if you look up Islam in Wikipedia or wherever, you're probably not going to find anywhere, at least in the synopsis, that this is a religion where whether or not you remember God's blessings determines whether you go to heaven or hell. That's not going to be in the first paragraph, or probably not in the entire article about Islam. Why is that? It's interesting to think about that, right? Both Islam's proponents or defenders and its detractors, its enemies, both of them describe Islam pretty much the same. And that's an interesting thing. They both will say there's 5 pillars of Islam. They both will say it's a religion that started 1,500 years ago. Although I think a lot of Islam's proponents would, I think, have the sense to say, no, it begins much before. Maybe they'll say it begins with Abraham. Maybe they'll say it begins, as they probably should say, that begins with Adam. But in any case, they'll say, that it certainly it's rooted in Muhammad and his followers about 1500 years ago. And they'll say that it consists of various practices and beliefs. And whenever I read that description, I feel, certainly when I read it in Wikipedia or whatever, I always feel like there's a covert attempt to belittle this belief system by making out to be just like any other belief system. It's no different from any other religion. And that's very contrary to what the Quran's saying. What it's trying to do is to put it in a box, put it at a distance, right? Why would I be concerned about something that's something from Arabia 1500 years ago, or that's done by people in other parts of the world who speak different languages, right? That doesn't concern me. But the truth is, there's nothing foreign about this. And just like I was saying, we already have a holiday called Thanksgiving. We already have acknowledged widely, even in scientific communities, medical communities, that gratitude is very important. Positive thinking is very important, crucially important for people's mental health, even for their physical health. Most doctors will tell you that positive thinking, which is basically gratitude, is beneficial to a patient's health, physical health. So there's nothing foreign about this. What is foreign is that God is not wearing kid gloves, meaning he doesn't cushion the truth. He doesn't say, you should be grateful. It's good for your mental health. But if you mess it up, it's okay. We'll all go to heaven. Or maybe we'll all just turn into nothing and it'll be fine. It'll be like being under anesthesia. Doctors like to wear kid gloves, right? That they comfort you, say it's okay. Try to be grateful. If you fail, we can always inject you with morphine, right? God doesn't say that. God says, be grateful, remember my blessing, or else you will suffer horribly. That's the truth. It's either gratitude or the opposite. And the opposite of gratitude in the Quran is called kufr, which literally means covering up. And what that means metaphorically is denying that you owe God any gratitude, and therefore denying God himself. And the punishment for that is hell. So, moving on. The other two verses I read were 49 and 50, which recall said, and when we saved you from the people of Pharaoh, who were afflicting you with an evil punishment, slaughtering your sons and letting live your women. And in that was a trial from your Lord great. And when we parted for you the sea, so we saved you, and we drowned the people of Pharaoh while you were looking. So now we have further details from the history of the Jewish people, and it's further sort of reasons why the Jewish people should be grateful to God. Because notice it's saying, and when, wahiv. But the passage began by saying, izkuru, remember. So implicitly what's saying is, remember when. Remember when you were slaves of the Egyptians, of Pharaoh and his people, and then we saved you from that slavery. We sent Moses at the same time that we sent Moses, as your messenger and prophet. We also sent him as your liberator, and we killed your enemies, the Egyptians, who drowned them in the sea, while we saved you. And not only that, but we'll find out that we made you, God made the Israelites inheritors of the land of Egypt and established them in the land, in that region. So it's just giving further reasons why the Jewish people should be grateful to God. Now, how does this apply more widely to all of human beings, well, that's something I guess we'd have to reflect on. Um, if we think about the story we've already heard of Adam and Eve, they also have had this experience of being evicted, right, from paradise. Um, Now, the Jewish people were not evicted, they were enslaved within Egypt, but they were released from that slavery. And likewise, Adam and Eve, although they are in a place where they were not originally, right? Because originally they're in paradise and now they're in earth. In that place, God sends them um, guidance and blessings. Um, so I think that, both the story of Adam and Eve and the story of the Israelites kind of encapsulates the situation for humans. God's not saying, be grateful to me because you never have any problems, because nobody can look at their life and say, I have no problems. That's not what it means to be grateful, right? What it means, I guess, is that whenever God sends you problems, he also sends the means of, if not solving those problems, at least dealing with those problems. Even to the point where if you follow that guidance, as it tells us a little earlier in baqarah, if you follow the guidance that's sent to you, you will have no fear and no grief. And if you even partially follow it, you probably have some fear and some grief, but you have a means of grappling with these problems that God has sent. So that's kind of what God's asking us to be grateful for. Not that he has not sent any problems whatsoever, right? I mean, he tells us that these are not, he doesn't use the word problems, he uses the word trial, right? He sends these trials, la'alakum tashkurun, so that you may be grateful. And earlier it says, la'alakum tatakun, so that you may defend yourself. And throughout the Quran, it tells us that he sends us trials so that we may remember him, so that we may um, get closer to um, serving him, right? So God sends trials, but he also sends the means of grappling with them. And it tells us elsewhere in the Quran as well that he doesn't test any person beyond his or her capacity, right? So the tests can be very great and very severe, and probably everyone has had the experience of feeling like whatever test they've been sent is really horrible, but it doesn't go past a certain point. It might seem to come exactly to the point of that you can't bear it anymore, but then it eases off. So that's what God kind of promises us. Um, so that's the reminder here. Um, Remember that yes, I afflicted you with a horrible punishment. In this case, the horrible punishment is the enslavement at the hands of the Egyptians, and even the fact that the Jewish people's male children were being killed, more or less, at birth, while the female children were allowed to live and then became slaves. And you can only imagine what that kind of life was, or what that would be like for the parents. So that was the punishment. And then the help that was sent is that then God destroys. He doesn't just liberate the Israelites, he destroys their enemies, destroys the Egyptians right before their very eyes. I think it even says that here. Um, yeah, when we parted for you the sea, so we saved you and we drowned the people of Pharaoh while you were looking, right? So your own people got to watch as their oppressors were drowned. Um, and that's something I mean, I mentioned that because if you ever watched a movie about people whose children have been killed, and of course in real life too, the families of the victims often call for execution and they say, I want to see my child's murderer killed. And nobody can really know that feeling unless they've experienced it. But I suppose we can take those people's word for it, that that's a very real need to see your oppressor, in this case, the murder of your own children, killed. And the Quran um, acknowledges that not only here, but in the fact that, as we'll find, it does have a penal code according to which if someone kills your family member, you are entitled to that person's blood. You're also um, sort of encouraged to forgive them. It says forgiveness is better, but you're entitled to blood for blood, basically. So God does not uh, hide that fact, right? It's a very real need in the human heart, and God here says, I satisfied that need for you. I let you see your oppressors drowned before your very eyes. So, yeah. Um, and then in verse 51, um, we begin to hear the story of how the Israelites, after being freed, then began almost immediately to kind of backslide and to start worshiping other gods besides God. In particular, this calf that we'll find out they kind of made by melting down some metal ornaments. But, um, you know, it's not hard if you're looking for it. It's not hard to see the connections between this history of the Jewish people and the history of human beings and even our own personal history. That there's this ebb and flow of blessings from God and of trials from God, challenges, and that um, as soon as God gives us blessing and sort of eases off the challenges or the trials, we start to backslide and we forget. So the point, of course, seems to be, well, don't forget, remember. And I will keep send you, God will keep sending these trials to give you further chances not to forget, to remember. But eventually, the opportunities will end, and then there'll just be the day on which it'll be too late to offer any ransom, and there'll be no one who can intervene for you with God. So before it's too late, and whether or not you're going through a challenging period, or whether or that period has eased off and God has sent you blessing, remember that God has helped you immeasurably, and that He's the only one who has helped you and can help you. That's what God is calling for here. And like I said, I mean, the main point of this lecture, I think, um, was that this is a message for all human beings. It's not hard to understand. It's not foreign. It doesn't consist of any culturally specific or even historically specific doctrine. I hesitate to say it, but it's just common sense. You have something that's invaluable, namely life and existence and the whole world. All human beings have that in one way or another. It obviously has not been, it didn't just come to you by accident. It's been given to you by your creator. And he is not indifferent. God is not indifferent to how you respond to having received this. And this is not, obviously, is not my words, not my message. This is the Quran's message. And if it seems like it's specific to me, it's just because, like I was saying earlier, I'm maybe because I have partly through uh, um, guidance that I've received um, from my father-in-law who teaches Quran, and partly because I come from a totally different cultural and religious background. But for whatever reason, I'm not prone to finding the Islamic elements in the Quran. I'm just reading it as um, trying to read it on its own merits, right? Sort of isolated from any specific religion. So it's right there in the Quran. But if you separate the Quran from the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, and separate it out from so-called Islam, this kind of long-established religious tradition, it's very straightforward, right? It's both very familiar, but also very radically different from human discourse and human traditions, right? Everything else is made by humans. The Quran is made by God. So it's both familiar but also very foreign. So I'll end there.